I invite you to turn your Bibles to James chapter 3. James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18 is going to be our passage this morning. In this short passage, James is going to describe for us two different kinds of wisdom. And it may surprise you the type of wisdom that he's describing. I think when we think of wisdom, we instinctually think of knowledge or information and our ability to communicate that knowledge, whether that be with what we're saying or in the way that we're able to answer questions on a test. What we're going to find is that the wisdom being talked about in this passage is information about God specifically, but it's an information that transforms our character, that changes the way that we live. So that what matters most is not what you're able to communicate by information, but what matters most is your conduct of life, your character, what others know you by. This passage, these few short verses, are going to serve as an assessment tool for us to expose what kind of wisdom we are actually living by, to then challenge us to pursue the right wisdom, and to also encourage us in the ways that we're already trying to do that. So follow along as I read for you in verses 13 to 18 of James chapter 3. James writes, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And you got to remember, a letter like this was meant to be read aloud to an audience, to a local church, very similar to what we've just done now. So when James wrote this, he had a group of people in mind, and when he wrote that question into his letter, he meant for the audience hearing that question to begin answering that question themselves. And the question is very simply, who is wise and understanding among you? Well, that should cause you to wonder, am I a wise and understanding person? And are the people around me wise and understanding people? Now, the question alone, as you hear that, I would hope that you hear that and would want to be someone who's wise and not foolish. All right, we'd want to fit the category that this question is asking for. And I'm curious, instinctively, how you answered that question when you heard it and what you were thinking about. Because I think a question like this, it's very tempting to hear it and think, well, I mean, in all humility, I am. I mean, you've asked the question, I'll be. With that in mind, how would you prove your answer? What would you have put forward to kind of show your wisdom? And again, I think instinctively, we think of what we would say. Well, I know the gospel. I know things about God. I can quote to you different passages that describe who God is. I love the book of Proverbs. I live there. I know the difference between right and wrong. I can explain that. I can counsel others with questions they have. James, it's me in all humility, but it's me. I am wise and understanding among you. And yet look at how he answers the question. By his good conduct. Oh, that's interesting. Not his speech, not his display of knowledge. No, by his good conduct. Let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom, in the humility that comes from wisdom. This idea that wisdom would show itself in works is not a new concept for James. If you're familiar with the letter that James wrote, you know that in the chapter before this, James has a long discussion about faith and works. And he says very clearly, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Or he says later in that conversation, faith apart from works is dead. His point in chapter 2 is that a true saving faith, a gift from God that serves those who have been regenerated, is a faith that's going to display itself in works. It's going to make itself evident in the way that it lives, in the way that it speaks, in the way that it thinks. So it's not surprising then, as he's coming to this point about wisdom, that he would expect a wisdom that comes from above as a gift would lead to some kind of life change taking place. And so it ought to make us wonder, do we actually fit the category of those who are wise and understanding? In verse 15, James is making a very clear contrast between two different types of wisdom. If you look at verse 15 again, he says, this wisdom, which he just described in verse 14, is not the wisdom that comes down from above, that'd be one type, but instead is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So there's one wisdom that's from above. And again, if you're familiar with the book of James, in chapter 1, James said that we ought not be deceived because every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So in verse 15, when it says that there's a wisdom from above, James is saying that there's a wisdom that God gifts to us. And he's saying that this divine wisdom is very different than this other wisdom, which if you look, he describes as earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So we could create a contrast between what we would consider divine wisdom and demonic wisdom, using the language that James has here. That really ought to grab our attention. That really ought to cause us to consider, well, wait, am I actually wise and understanding, someone with divine wisdom, or do I have demonic wisdom? And you might think that's a bit bold coming from James. But James in his letter is very bold. If you look at chapter 4, verse 4, he says pretty clearly, calling them out for what we even look at near the end of our time together, but he'll call out their kind of fighting amongst themselves. And he says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. James is about creating contrasts for us, choices. Do we want the divine wisdom or the demonic wisdom? Do we want to be a friend of the world, an enemy of God, or a friend of God and an enemy of the world? Again, it's meant to grab our attention and to show us the significance of what he's bringing up. This isn't as simple as, oh man, I want to be more wise and not foolish. Oh, this would be good for me. No. Not only does this have implication for your relationships, as we'll see, but this has implication for eternity. What kind of wisdom is it that you're living after? What kind of wisdom is it that you're living out of? So we're going to ask ourselves some diagnostic questions this morning. Some questions that will help us make not only to understand this passage, but apply it to ourselves as we try to assess what kind of wisdom am I living by? Divine wisdom or demonic wisdom? So the first diagnostic question we'll consider is simply this: how are my relationships? How are my relationships? Are my relationships disorderly or peaceful? When I think about my relationships with others, what comes to mind? Disorderliness or peace? If you look in verse 16, as he's reminding us of this, where this jealousy and selfish ambition exist, he tells us that those who are living from those types of motives, which comes from this demonic wisdom, What's going to happen in relationships is that there will be disorder in every vile practice. When we think of disorder, another word that can come to mind is confusion. It's just a confusing relationship. Are we friends or enemies? Do they like me or do they hate me? Are we on the same page or are we not? Do we enjoy time together or do we not? There's confusion involved. There's disorderliness. Or when you think about this every vile practice, this idea of evil work, this idea of evil taking place, where God would be dishonored by how that relationship is functioning. What's being said or not said. What's being thought about each other that's maybe not being expressed. Just a lot going on that is evil about that relationship. So one question as you're considering your relationships is, well, are they disorderly or are they peaceful? Look at verse 18 as it speaks of the results of someone who has a divine wisdom. He says, a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Rather than disorder, there's peace. And not just only this idea of being calm, but that's the idea in which you're not warring parties. You're at peace with one another. You're for each other's best interest. Your relationship is good. It's pleasant. It's one that you want more time with, not one that you leave exhausted from. And those who live with divine wisdom are those who are sowing in peace, this harvest of righteousness, this relationship that leads to good things, and it's done by those who are making peace or working for peace. So if you're living by divine wisdom, your relationships with others are going to be peaceful. If you're living by demonic wisdom, the relationships you're in are going to be disorderly. It's what James is showing us. It's what he's helping us to see clearly. So that diagnostic question about how your relationships are, it's good for you to slow down even now and think about, what is the tone, what is the flavor of your relationships with others? If you're married, what is the flavor of relationship with your spouse? If you're a parent, what's your relationship like with your children? What's your relationship like with extended family? Siblings of yours, parents of yours, aunts and uncles of yours, cousins of yours, grandparents, grandchildren. What is the tone of that relationship? Maybe with friends. Not only your very close friends, but also those that you would call friends that are maybe acquaintances. But what's the flavor of those relationships? What are your interactions like with your neighbors? Maybe you wouldn't call them friends, but I'm sure you see them and interact with them. What's that interaction like? Peaceful or disorderly? Many of you have coworkers that you see many hours in a week. What are your relationships like with them? Maybe you serve in more of a manager or superior position towards others. What are your relationships like with them? Or maybe you have a boss or a manager that you see frequently. What's your relationship like with them? Another way to consider this is when conflict happens in any of those relationships, what happens then? Because it's not a matter of if conflict happens. No, we live in a broken world. We are sinful people living amongst sinful people in a sin-cursed world. So conflict will be present. So if you think conflict ought to be absent, that is an idealized world that's not going to happen on this side of eternity. Conflict will happen. So the question is, when conflict happens in any of those relationships, what happens then? Is it something that's ignored and unaddressed and just adds to the weight of the wedge that's separating that relationship? Is it maybe something that comes up in conversation in a very bombastic, loud, and angry way? It's just another opportunity to duke it out with this person. Or is it maybe something that leads to healthy conversation, that leads towards resolution, reconciliation, forgiveness, and maybe even draws you closer to this person in relationship. What happens? Now, it's not about perfection, right? So the question isn't, are all your relationships perfect? Because again, that would be an unrealistic world. But it's a question of direction. What direction do your relationships head towards? More towards peace or more towards disorderliness? Now, it might be that some of you, even hearing some of these questions, are thinking, wow, all my relationships are broken. And it's all their fault. They're all living by demonic wisdom. It's all clear to me now. If only they were all here to hear this. There'd be peace. I will pray for them. Right? It's very tempting to land there in our thoughts. Remember hearing a joke once about a person going to a doctor and just saying to the doctor, everything hurts. I touch my shoulder, I touch my arm, I touch my head, I touch my neck, I touch my leg, everything hurts. What's wrong? Doctor does the assessment and says, well, good news is only one thing's wrong, and it's your finger, it's broken. This is the common denominator in all the pain. Well, for a moment, think about this. If every relationship you're in is broken, is it possible you're the common denominator? Is that possible? Now, if you're quick to say it's not, James has more to say to you. But if in your humility, you're able to think for a moment, could it possibly be me? Don't be too quick to assume it's everyone else's fault. And that's part of what James is getting at in this passage. Divine wisdom is a humble wisdom, right? It talks about meekness of wisdom. It talks about being open to reason, as we'll see later. But true wisdom leads to true humility. Someone who's able to just consider, is it me? Am I possibly a source of this brokenness in these relationships? So that's the first question to consider. How are my relationships? Are they peaceful or are they disorderly? Second diagnostic question we can see in this text is this question: what do I contribute to my relationships? What do I contribute to my relationships? In verse 14 and 16, verse 14 he says, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth." Or he says again in verse 16, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." Well, those with demonic wisdom are contributing bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. To be ambitious is to want something, to work towards something. Not all ambition is wrong. Godly ambition has you about the things of God. Selfish ambition has you about the things of self. And James is saying that there are those who with demonic wisdom are those who are living selfishly. They're about what they want. So when you think back to the list that he gives us in verse 15 of wisdom that is demonic, that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic, we begin to get a sense of what he means by unspiritual. It's another way of saying that it's fleshly. It's coming from your flesh. It's what appeals to you. Well, what is it that appeals to us in our sinful flesh? What is it that we want? Well, as he talks about wisdom being earthly, I think it brings to mind, or ought to bring to mind, what we've talked about in the past about the world, wanting us to care about power, wealth, popularity, and pleasure. Right? I feel like those categories catch most of what our flesh wants. We want control, we want more than we have, we want others to like us, and we want to be comfortable. We want things to go well and to go good. So to be someone who's functioning with that type of selfish ambition, you're going to be working as hard as you can to get any and all of those things and more than you presently have. That's what you're going to be about. To be someone who's bitterly jealous is to recognize what you perceive as to what others have that you don't, and your desire for it. You want what they have. Now again, not all jealousy is sinful. So God is a jealous God, but God is jealous for what brings him glory. A bitter jealousy that's being described in this passage is a jealousy for what they are selfishly ambitious for. What's going to bring them glory? What's going to bring them pleasure? And these people are those with demonic wisdom, are those who are sitting there assessing others and seeing what others have and wanting it badly, with bitterness. Not able to celebrate what God has blessed others with, but just sad that they have it and you don't. And so you either strategize how to take it from them, how to gain more than they have, or how to make them feel bad about having what you don't have. You're just a sour, disagreeable person when you have demonic wisdom in your relationships, unable to celebrate with those who have things to celebrate. What do you contribute? Or, on the flip side of jealousy or selfish ambition, James describes for us in verse 17 what I'll describe or summarize as Christ-likeness. Listen to what someone with divine wisdom contributes to their relationships. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Those who are pure, who are living with purity in mind, are those who are wanting to do what's right and care about what's right. They want to be right before God's eyes. They want to be pure before him. If you look down at chapter 4 and you look at verse 8, in the middle of that verse he says, "Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." So when we care about purity and we're thinking divinely with divine wisdom, we understand that that purity has to begin at the heart level, the motives. And we understand that we are talking about putting off sin, in need of being forgiven of that sin, in need of being cleansed of our sin and changed. That's what we begin to understand. It has to happen at a heart level. And we care about that, not only for ourselves, but for others around us. And because we care about those things, we're going to be those who contribute in our relationships towards pushing towards what's pure as opposed to what's not. Not only that, but we're going to be those who are peaceable. You think about what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Those who are peaceable are those who work to make and to keep peace. They're those who work towards what is opposite of quarreling and strife and divisiveness and disunity. But they're thinking strategically and prioritizing what leads towards peace. They're not those who forsake truth, because again, to be those who are pure is to care about what's right, and truth is what's right, and we don't want falsehood. And yet there's a balance there. They're not hostile or quarrelsome in the way that they pursue that truth. You think of what Paul says about those who are servants of the Lord, and he says they must be gentle in the way they correct their opponents, not quarrelsome. So these are men of God that Paul's addressing in 2 Timothy 2, and he's saying to them, don't be someone who's out there starting up fights and quarreling for the truth. But he's also not saying, don't care about the truth. No, he's saying be gentle in the way you correct your opponents. Do it peaceably. So there's a way to have it in tension, to keep it in balance. We're those who are peaceable. We're those who are gentle. And you think about gentleness and how that can be seen in your demeanor, how it can be heard in your tone, how it can be understood by the choice of your words. And if you think about a moment where someone has been hostile to you or angry in the way that they're approaching you, you understand what it is to see a demeanor and a tone and to hear words that are not gentle. Well, those who are divinely wise are those who care about having gentleness in their lives. They prioritize that. When they come across a verse like Ephesians 4:29, their ears perk up, and they want to know what it is to speak in such a way that others are built up. They're intrigued when Paul says that we should care about what fits the occasion. We want to grow in our discernment of how to speak and when to speak. I think a verse that I found back in Proverbs recently has stood out on this. I'll read it to you. Proverbs 16, verse 23. Listen to what Solomon says. The heart of the wise, that's who we want to be, right? The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Listen to the intentionality that the wise of heart takes to make his speech judicious and to add persuasiveness to his lips. There are times where we want to blame the listener for our anger. Well, if you just understood what I was trying to say, if you just knew the intentions behind what I said, you'd understand I was not trying to be quarrelsome. I was not trying to be angry. My question to you, though, is, are you able to say before the Lord you were trying to be gentle? That you were intentionally thinking about your demeanor, your tone, and your words, and choosing to build up and to serve your listener or not? Because it's not enough to say, well, I was not intending that. That's part of it. But were you intending gentleness? What James is getting at is, what are you contributing to these relationships? Purity, peaceable, gentleness. Are you someone that is open to reason? Or are you someone that's always right? I'm sure you know those people, where you get around them and a conversation comes up and they're just always right, even when they're wrong. And they will go down fighting on whatever it is they've decided to plant their flag in, because everything's something to put their flag in. Every hill's a hill to die on because they're always right. Or are you someone that's open to reason? Someone who's willing to change your mind? Are you someone that cares about truth enough that it's better to be wrong and learn the truth than it was just to be right? Are you open to reason? Are you able to have a conversation with someone that you disagree with in an agreeable and respectful way? Do you contribute that type of tone to your conversations? Are you someone that's full of mercy? Are you able to overlook offenses? If others treated you like you treat them, would they be someone who's merciful in the way they overlook your offenses? And that's one of the realities of what ought to stir our own mercy towards others, is we realize how much mercy we've received from the Lord and how much mercy we need from others in the way that we continue to struggle and our desire to be divinely wise and not demonically wise. But do you think that way? Are you intentionally gearing yourself up that way in your relationships towards others? Not only overlooking offenses that are done to you, but are you also someone who is helping those who are in need? Who's seeking ways to serve people around you and not just avoiding those who are needy? Are you someone that has good fruits? Being someone who's not only full of mercy, but full of good fruits. One commentator said that Christianity is not a barren tree. That was really helpful. Are we those who have good fruits in our lives? And you might wonder, well, what kind of fruits? Well, Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Are you someone who is bearing those types of fruits? And are those fruits the types of things you're contributing to your relationships around you? Or as he says there in the end, are you someone who is impartial and sincere? To be impartial is to be someone who's not playing favorites. Or are you someone that is choosing who you're kind to? So is it that your closest friends know you as divinely wise, but everybody else only knows you as other than that? Because you choose who to act favorably towards based off of who you like, as opposed to who God just brings into your life. Or are you someone that's impartial, who's able to recognize that any person you're in front of speaking to, no matter their age, no matter their place in Christ, no matter their place in life, no matter whatever factors may be different than what would make them different than you, are you able to recognize them as someone made in the image of Christ who deserves your divine wisdom, you living out that divine wisdom towards them? Are you able to do that? Or do you find yourself acting partially? Well, if you were older, well, if you're closer to my age, well, if we shared interests, if we were closer in a relationship, I'd put more effort into it. Or are you someone that recognizes whomever's around you is worth your effort? Or you think about someone who's sincere. Another way of saying someone who's without hypocrisy. You're consistent. Who you act like in front of others is actually who you are. Is that true of you? So asking this question, what do I contribute to my relationships? Summarizing that list in verse 17 as Christ-likeness. Are you someone who's contributing Christ-likeness or the jealous ambition and the bitter jealousy? What are you contributing? The reality is, you need the help of others to answer that question well. There are even times where you might think to yourself, oh, I know what I'm contributing. It's always demonic wisdom. And it may be true that there is presence of selfish ambition and bitter jealousy in your life that is coming out in quarreling, in anger, in strife, in selfishness in the way you're interacting. That could be true. But you still need others' help to know if that's all that's present. Because there are times where we can become so focused on what is wrong in our lives that we miss out on what God is actually causing to grow also in our lives. But it also works the other way around, where you might be sitting there thinking, I get it, I'm not perfect, I just don't see my imperfections. I get it, I'm not saying I'm perfectly wise, but I read this list of being Christ-like and I think I'm, again, in all humility, I think I'm that person. What about me? How do I get help for that? Well, you get help by asking others. You get help by looking at somebody and saying, what do I contribute in our relationship? Oh, you're just so wise. Okay, but besides that, when are the times I've not been wise in our relationship? When are the times that I've been quarrelsome? When I've been selfish? When are those times? You want to pursue that from others because we can be so easily blind to what others may actually see very clearly. We often have what David calls in Psalm 19 hidden faults in our lives. Now, once a hidden fault has been revealed to you, it's no longer hidden, which means there's still faults that are hidden from you. We ought to have a category where we just understand there are faults we cannot see, where we need the help of others to point that out. And it's pretty incredible what kind of verbal habits we can get into in the way we speak towards others that we are unable to see ourselves. I remember, it was about 6 months ago, it's been paralyzing ever since, but my wife saying, you often say that you're bugged. I'm like, bugged? That's such a silly, weird word. Why would I ever say that? I don't say that I'm bugged. She's like, no, you say it frequently throughout a day, and you always accompany it with, I'm bugged. I'm like, that is weird. There's no way. There's no way. Oh my. It's constant. And I wish it was enough to say, I felt it, I saw it, don't do it. No, it takes a lot of work to change that. But I would have never known. And had someone said, do you say you're bugged ever? No, of course I don't. And it bugs me that you would even ask me that, right? I mean, it's just like these moments that we don't see. Well, that's on kind of a sillier thing. But James is talking about some pretty important, significant, and weighty issues. And the reality is, you may not see what others see so clearly in your life, which also works the other way. Others around you where you're thinking to yourself, that was a cringeworthy moment in that relationship. But it was so obvious, I'm sure they know that. Oh, don't be so sure. And it may be that God is helping you be aware of these cringeworthy moments and relationships around you so that you could put to practice divine wisdom that gently, respectfully, kindly, lovingly steps into that person's life and says, did you know that you have a habit of whatever that might be? We need people in our lives. And one of the questions to consider, kind of to chase that for a moment, how do you react when someone brings something to your attention? How do you react? If your disposition is instinctively defensive and discounting everything anybody would ever bring to your attention because you're convinced you know everything, well, that is something to be aware of and to fight against. We want to be those that when someone comes to us with critique, that we're able to, with divine wisdom, listen well. And to consider, do they see something that I don't presently see? And as God kindly and graciously in his commitment to me to be more like Christ, sent this individual to help me. That's the type of mindset we want to have when we're having these types of conversations with each other. So diagnostic question 1, how are my relationships? Are they disorderly or peaceful? Diagnostic question number 2, what do I contribute to my relationships? Do I contribute Christ-likeness or jealousy and selfish ambition? Third diagnostic question, what do I want from my relationships? What do I want from my relationships? People are to be seen as those to be loved and served. So you think about the greatest commandment that Jesus has given us. We love God, we love others. Well, who counts as others? Everyone not you. So that means everyone not you is to be loved and to be served. If we're aware of that, if we're clear in that, if we're given divine wisdom to know that, then we're going to be those who look at others around us and want the opportunities to love and to serve the people around us. We're going to want that. Even when it's messy, even when it's complex, even when it's difficult, we're still going to want to love and to serve those around us. Paul Tripp talks about relationships, and he says that when sin gets involved, what can happen is that we can wrongly view others around us as either vehicles to what we really want or obstacles in the way of what we really want. So going back to this idea of an earthly, unspiritual, and demonic ambition where we want power, wealth, popularity, and pleasure, if we're someone who's living that way and we are struggling as we see others as vehicles for what we want, then we're going to see everybody around us in an opportunistic way, where we're thinking, can this person get me what I want? And if so, I'm going to draw them close. And I'm going to be friends with them because they're going to help me get whatever it is that I want. Or if we're looking around and thinking, well, that vehicle is going to be a slow vehicle to whatever it is I want, then I don't want that relationship. I'm going to seek out the relationship that will serve me best. Or let's think about the category of obstacle. If we know clearly what it is that we want, and we're assessing others around us to see if they're a vehicle or obstacle, and we think that person is actually going to keep me from what I want, then we're going to become angry towards them. We're going to see them as someone keeping us from what we think we're entitled to, or what we think we deserve. And there's going to be conflict because we want something and that person is in the way. Do you see how dehumanizing both of those options are? To look at someone around you that God has made in his image, and rather than seeing someone to love, we see someone that can serve us or someone who is in our way. We want to strive to have a divine wisdom that leads us to care about wanting the right things from our relationship. And it takes effort to slow down and consider our desires. It takes work. To slow down and think, what am I working towards in my relationships? When I think about these categories of relationships, what is it that I am striving after with these people? Am I actually looking for ways to love and to serve them? Am I considering if they need to be evangelized or if they need discipleship? Am I considering that? Do I see people around me and consider, do they need encouragement or do they need correction or do they just need a friend to weep with them in this season? Am I thinking that way? Is that what I'm wanting? Or am I just annoyed with these people who are in my way as I'm trying to get what I want? Other ways to ask this question, to try to think about what we want. What am I sad that I don't have? What is it I want that I don't yet have? And when I think about that, it just discourages me. Or what do I have that if it were taken, I'd be sad about? Or another way to think about it, if I could just push a button and just change it all, what would be changed and what would the results be? If I could just push that button, what would I get? What would I want? Taking time to consider those questions helps you to uncover what it is that you want. Now, we're asking these diagnostic questions. How are my relationships? What do I contribute to my relationships? What do I want from my relationships? Because it's a weighty matter we're considering. Divine wisdom versus demonic wisdom. I think we have to ask the question, how did you do? How'd you do? Now, it might be, by this point, you're discouraged. Taking an assessment of how your relationships are, thinking a little bit about what you contribute, and recognize, I'm contributing demonic wisdom to my relationships. And I think it's all I've known. And maybe even as you hear the descriptions of what Christ-likeness is in relationships, you think, well, that just seems impossible. That just seems other than who I am. What hope is there? What hope is there to change if what you see is mainly demonic wisdom? Or maybe you're sitting there and you feel conflicted. Because there's moments where you've thought, man, I'm encouraged. I can remember when I was a certain way in my relationships towards others. I remember the conversations others had with me. I remember the season God took me through in teaching me and humbling me and growing me and maturing me. And I think I'm doing better than I was. I'm encouraged. Then maybe you've heard other parts and thought, wow, I didn't realize I'd have to give attention to that also. I didn't realize that was present in my life also. And so there's this confliction between both feeling encouraged and discouraged, feeling this mixture between both the demonic and the divine wisdom present in your life. And you're maybe wondering, what is the path towards greater divine wisdom? What is the means to growing and cultivating more of that wisdom in my life? Maybe by this point, you're impressed with yourself. And you think, I have arrived. You might hear that and think, well, who in the world could sit here and think that after a passage like this? And the reality is, you interact with enough people. You interact with enough people who are spiritually blind, hardened in their conscience towards sin, and you actually begin to meet these people who will sit here and say to themselves, yes, I get it. I'm doing that. They're not. Yeah, I agree. They're not. But what about you again? Come again? Oh, I'm saying I'm doing this. And you mean direction, not perfection, right? No, I'm saying I can't think of anything I've done wrong to contribute towards what's happening in this conflict. Wow. That's just not reality. That's just not true. Even if I'm unable to identify in the moment what that person is struggling with, I know that struggles are happening. That's just reality. That's the reality that Scripture teaches us. There's another verse in Proverbs 30, verse 12. It says, there are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth. By God's grace and his work of humility in us, it keeps us from being those who say, I'm clean, while we're sitting there in filth that we've not been washed from. So I want to kindly say to you who are maybe sitting there, not feeling your conscience triggered by any of what we've looked at, that should be concerning for you. It should concern you if you come out of a passage like this clean in your own eyes, though you've not yet been washed from your filth. For those who are discouraged and conflicted, what should you do? What should we do? What should I do? What do we do with this? Well, James is writing a church, and notice that in these verses, he's describing the people in this church. He's assuming that there's going to be this conflict between the divine wisdom and the demonic wisdom. He's assuming that there are those sitting there who are in need of being told and reminded that they have more to change in their lives. Look now at chapter 4. Let me read for you verses 1 to 3. And you just pay attention to what kind of wisdom you think's at play in verses 1 to 3. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. I would have liked to have met James as a pastor, considering these Christians and saying, there is a distinction between divine wisdom and demonic wisdom. One leads to peace, one leads to disorder. You want to have the divine wisdom. And in case you're not listening, think about the relationships in your church right now. What's happening? Do you want to know why there's conflict? It's you. Do you want to know why you are angry at each other and murdering? It's you. Assess yourself. There is filth to be addressed. Verse 4, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And you might think, if I'm already discouraged, that's more discouraging. If I'm already conflicted, that's more conflicting. I thought this was where the hope was. Keep reading. Or do you suppose it's to no purpose that the scripture says God yearns jealously over the spirit that he's made to dwell in us? What he's about to do is he's saying God is aware and he cares. He cares what's happening in regards to your wisdom. He cares about these relationships that are taking place. God yearns jealously over the spirit he's placed in you. God has saved you, he's rescued you, he's placed you in his family, he cares. So what does he do about it? Look at verse 6. He gives more grace. So you come out of James 3 and think, oh my. And left to yourself, yes, oh my. But God does not leave us to ourselves. James is not saying to you, so try harder. No, he's saying, look to God, the one who yearns jealously over you, and God gives more grace. For those who are not Christians, it's by grace you are saved. God choosing to save you, graciously loving you with mercy. Christian, it's by God's grace generously given to you that you grow and mature. How is it God can be a gracious God? Because of how he's proven that grace in Christ. With his life, his death, his resurrection. Because of Christ's payment for our sin on the cross, God is able to extend grace to those who need to be saved and grace to us who need to be sanctified. And James is saying, he gives more grace. And yet, interestingly, therefore, James says, therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So if you are discouraged, or if you are conflicted and wanting to grow in divine wisdom, James is saying you are in need, great need, desperate need of God's grace, and he gives it generously. And you're also in need of humility. Humility is as simple as going to God and saying, God, I see it more clearly than I've seen it, and I need your help. Chapter 1, verse 5, if you lack wisdom, what we've just talked about, let him ask of God, who gives generously without reproach. It takes humility to acknowledge we need something we don't have and can't accomplish ourselves. It's pride that sits there and says, no, I'm impressed enough with myself. I don't need that. That's pride, and God opposes that. But he gives grace to the humble. Verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God. Submit to him. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. How is it that you are able to do those things? By God's grace. Asking for that grace to repent in the way that's being described. And verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. The question about what wisdom you're living by is a significant question. It's one that has implications for all the relationships around you. But it's also a weighty question because it has a significance for your relationship with God. It matters what wisdom you're living by, the one from above or the one from around you. And in your discouragement or feeling that conflict between the two, James is inviting you to go to the God who gives more grace in humility and ask him to accomplish what you cannot accomplish yourself. Let's pray together.